everybody, welcome to Deep Analysis Episode 3. Today I'm going to talk about Maverick and Death and Taxes with experts Phil Gallagher of ThrabenU and DougesOnTwitch of GreenSunZenith.com. Both of them have websites dedicated to their deck that they're here to talk about today, so who better to give us the rundown? So, Phil, who are you? Why are you qualified to talk about Death and Taxes?
Hi, everyone. I'm Phil Gallagher. I've been playing Death and Taxes for about 10 years now, and I've got a handful of good results to my name, including a classic top 8, a challenge top 8 or two, probably about 20-ish IQ top 8s with the deck, and I've probably spent more time writing about the archetype than anybody else at this point. You can find my content at ThrabenU on Twitch, YouTube, and Twitter.
Sounds like an expert to me. Douges, who are you?
Hey, I'm DougesOnTwitch. I stream Legacy Maverick, and about 2.5 years ago, I created the Green Sun Zenith, which is a platform kind of dedicated to the archetype. I was actually a Death and Taxes player in Legacy, and then I think in 2018 I switched over, and yeah, I haven't looked back. It's a really cool deck. In terms of finishes, nothing really noticeable, but yeah, I'm just a massive fan of the community and the archetype itself.
That's cool. I'm glad there is someone dedicated to Maverick out there. That's not an archetype that I would necessarily think has a whole website dedicated to it. Like maybe in 2012, but to find out that there is somebody out there actively working on the deck in the present day, it was really exciting, and I'm glad you could make it to this episode. So, what are Death and Taxes and Maverick? I guess I'll kick it off here. Death and Taxes is a mono-white Hate Bears Prison kind of deck. Maverick is a green-white Hate Bears Prison kind of deck. And that's super general. I'll let the experts break it down from there. But both these decks play Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Both have Mother of Runes, Stoneforge Mystic, Wasteland, Swords to Plowshares, and Caracas. So that sort of core shell is intact in both of the archetypes. But that's about where the similarities end. The goal of this conversation is to figure out, if you're into this sort of thing, which one is right for you. So let's start with a history lesson, because Death and Taxes is an old deck, old as time. It's like Gandalf the Grey versus to the Gandalf the White that is Maverick. And let's go back in time and figure out where this deck came from. So Phil, give us a history lesson about Death and Taxes.
Okay, so in approximately 2006, MTG The Source user Finn starts mucking around with a Mangara and Ether Vial deck. And the goal here was to keep recycling Mangara activations and slowly grind your opponent into oblivion. Here's the thing, though. The white cards that would support the rest of the shell there sucked. At that time, Death and Taxes would have to play threats like Isamaru, and like when you're trying to finish with a 2/2 and your opponents have like Tarmogoyfs or something like that, it's not necessarily the best place to be. And so early versions of the deck didn't have quite enough aggression to be a great aggro deck, and not quite enough hate bears to be a real control deck either. And so the deck was at like fringe playability status for a very, very long time. Until about 2011, when Thalia Guardian of Thraben gets printed, and almost overnight, this deck goes from being a fringe contender to something that is going to have a real solidified place in the metagame for the entirety of the rest of Legacy.
Yeah, so before we dig any deeper into this deck, the name, Death and Taxes. This comes from an era when the naming conventions were a little different. You look back in the history of Legacy and you get names like Death and Taxes or Cephalid Breakfast, or just like these goofy names that don't describe what the deck does. So Death and Taxes, the phrase is, you could count on two things in life, and that's death and taxes. That's a thing that English speakers say. I don't know if that phrase is elsewhere in the world, but that's what you can count on. And I think the name of the deck was birthed from it's mono white, so you can count on it, and the Mangara lock, you can count on that killing you eventually. So you have the inevitability, and it's just a really dependable deck with crushing inevitability, like Death and Taxes. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I believe the original quote is Ben Franklin. There's two things certain in life: death and taxes.
Yeah,
And then, as a joke, a third thing was added to this list: death, taxes, and somebody's always going to be playing White Weenie.
perfect. So the meme gets three-dimensional at that point. So that's where the name comes from. So 2011 Thalia Guardian of Thraben gets printed, which I mentioned was the first card that comes to my mind when I think of both of these decks. So when did Death and Taxes break out? Like, when did it start showing up and really winning tournaments?
So I'd say the moment that stands out in my mind the most is GP Strasbourg in, I believe, 2013, where Thomas Enevoldsen and Michael Bonde just absolutely show up with Death and Taxes and crush the event and take it by storm. And before that, Death and Taxes was kind of viewed as this like fringe deck. If you play Legacy a lot, you know what it is and how it works, but otherwise, you don't really know how to play against it. And from there on out, it starts picking up a lot of traction on the SCG tour in particular. And you see these like Death and Taxes Masters starting to appear, and you start to see it being a great metagame call and a deck that people really start to specialize in around this time.
Yeah, I remember those days. Like, I think Patrick Sullivan and Cedric Phillips were doing commentary the first time Death and Taxes really won an open or top eighted an open, really showed up and showed out. And it started as a joke. They were like, oh, this White Weenie deck is 5-0 on day one and it got a feature match. And then it was also like playing for top eight in round 10. And like, then it was in the top eight. And they went from like, haha, yeah, I guess it's cute. You can bounce Mangara with Caracas to, okay, they're starting to get the hooks in. The Caracas lock is just a few turns away. Like, that happened over the course of like one day where they really started to respect and understand the archetype and the play patterns. And then didn't a couple of European guys, was it Thomas and Michael, who took a long vacation and played in 3 Star City Opens over the course of a month, and they just like farmed them while they were over on our shores?
Another player who did that sort of thing was Mark Koenig, who has a couple of very, very memorable feature matches, including one where he vials in a Thalia to effectively counter a Terminus. That was just like chef's kiss.
That is beautiful. I remember watching that and I was just like, oh no, nobody, like, why did he come over here and show America that this deck's good? I don't want to play against it. And then I remember this brilliant metagame move in the Star City Players Championship one year. Like, that's where like the 16 best players of the year face off for $100,000 or whatever. It's a super tight metagame. And the decks to beat were Delver and Sneak and Show going into that tournament. And I think it was Brad Nelson, Todd Anderson, and one other person they test with just showed up with Death and Taxes and couldn't lose in Legacy in that tight little Delver Sneak and Show metagame. So there is a right spot for Death and Taxes throughout history and even today. So,
yeah. As a counterpoint to that, though, there are also very wrong spots for Death and Taxes. And when you're playing this deck in the wrong metagame, you feel the pains of playing a bunch of small white creatures.
yeah, so we're going to talk about Oko, Thief of Crowns, in a couple minutes here, but let's talk about Maverick a little bit. So, Douges, tell us about Maverick. Where did this deck come from?
Yeah, so Maverick is, as you said before, a green-white based deck that originated in Europe. There's a few sort of deck techs, and there's an Inside the Deck series for Maverick interviewing some US pros in 2011 who talk about it as kind of a big European deck that didn't really pick up in America. But once people started seeing the results of it, especially against the Delver meta, people wanted to try it. So I believe it was around 2011 that I found the legacy-friends.org, kind of like the MTG The Source or MTG Salvation of Europe, where they discussed the deck, which prior to Green Sun Zenith played around with Aether Vial. I believe some versions played with Survival before it was banned. But it was kind of known as like a green-white aggro deck or a Vial Hate Bears or green-white Survival. I see a few references to Pandora's Box, and that's a pretty good explanation of what the deck is trying to do and what it can achieve. But yeah, it's obviously a pretty highly tunable deck for a metagame that you want to target, thanks to cards like Green Sun Zenith that kind of allow you to play one creature but have 5 copies of it in the deck, which is cool. So 2010 is the first time that I saw it top 8 with Luis Viciano. Hopefully that name is correct. Who is kind of the godfather of the deck. I believe their MTGO username was Maverick with an @ as the A, and that's kind of where the deck name came from. Maverick itself kind of means from the left or something you don't really expect, a little bit rogue, so that works as well. So it's a little bit like Nick Fit, where there's a few kind of stories behind the name, but I think that the MTGO name is what most people go with, and with Luis being, the creator of kind of what we know the deck to be today.
Yeah, I definitely know Maverick. It's named after the user who piloted it, much like Pokepile today or Strifopile. Like Maverick is the original Strifopile, so it is named after them as far as I know.
Yeah, there was one other story that I heard that was named after the movie Top Gun because it used to play Nimble Mongoose.
Oh,
So you have your Maverick and Goose, but I don't think that's I don't think that's right.
Maverick is also a famous American cowboy from the old westerns, and one of my friends, probably around 2012, borrowed a giant cowboy hat from a friend to play Maverick at Gen Con for 4 days. So that's also part of the legend of that deck.
Interesting, because that is the intro song to the Inside the Deck Maverick on YouTube.
It's all coming together.
So there's a 2011 finish with the deck in February. So the same month that Green Suns came out, Marinari Manuel came first in a 73-player tournament, and then there's one that was a 171-player tournament that Luis took down. The green-white Vial deck had cards like Weathered Wayfarer. I think Jodis Grunt was in the build. And then that was kind of where I first picked up the deck. But then I saw that there's actually another top 8 in that same tournament with Maverick and with Green Sun Zenith. So it's interesting to see Luis go to a tournament with, the version that he knew, that he understood, with Vial instead of Green Suns, and obviously did really well with it.
So I'm glad you mentioned Aether Vial, because about a year and a half ago, I was talking, like Maverick started to make a little bit of a resurgence on Magic Online, and I was just on my stream, I was like, oh yeah, it's an Aether Vial deck, this, that, and one of my friends, Max, who's played a lot of Maverick, was like, it's not an Aether Vial deck, it never was. And I was like, are you serious? I remember Aether Vial. Is this like a Mandela effect thing? And I looked back in list and could not find any instances of Aether Vial in Maverick ever. And I was like, wow, my mind is blown. This gives me some hope that I'm not completely insane.
So in 2011 was when the Source and MTG Salvation sort of forums kicked off as well, mentioning the deck with Green Sun. So I kind of feel like the Vial versions got a little bit shunned just because of the timing of cards like Green Suns coming into the format, and people wanting to focus on that going forward with the deck and seeing how it can evolve. 2011 was also probably the biggest first finish for the deck. It was GP Amsterdam, where it came 5th in the hands of Fabia Gozin with Punishing Maverick, featuring a new card, Scavenging Ooze, which is pretty cool. And at the end of 2011 was Worlds, where it came up as a Punishing Maverick deck. And then in December, Jerry Thompson top-aided at SEG with it. There's been a few pretty good finishes over that time, because I know that the TC Decks tool actually had Maverick as the best performing deck from September 2011 until March 2012, every month between then, which is pretty crazy, especially when you see the deck now. Not as powerful as it was, but obviously a pretty big contender back then.
Yeah, I definitely remember that era of Legacy. That's really where I was starting to like get good at Legacy. I got into Legacy around 2008, just sort of mucked around with my friends, but I was really like traveling to the Star City tournaments by this point, and the metagame was a pretty firm Esper, Stoneblade, Maverick, Rug Delver, and then the other stuff was like fringe options. But like, and it was pretty competitive. It wasn't a rock, paper, scissors or anything. It was like each of these decks has strengths and weaknesses against each of the other ones. And Maverick was just like the real deal. I think Maverick is part of the reason I pivoted onto elves so hard during that era. Like, I got sick of my Delvers getting chewed up by Umezawa's Jitte.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I can see, once a deck comes into the format and people see it's a good answer to the format, it would make some players make some, different choices about the deck they want to play, especially those bringing sort of Rug Delver to a format that, one's Knights are 4/4. It's pretty hard to beat, especially in game 1.
Yeah, for sure. And the Maverick has continued to evolve over time. Like you mentioned, Punishing Maverick. We've seen Dark Maverick. We've seen Wet Maverick. Like, basically, it splashed every possible other color into it in some build or another at some point or another. Like the deck is so customizable. It's just super cool.
Yeah, the flexibility is definitely a huge draw because, obviously those different archetypes are going to be good against different formats and metas. So, depending on your local meta or what you see online, you can adapt it pretty easily and play some pretty powerful cards within each series. I think, although Punishing Maverick is kind of not in the greatest position because of cards like Punishing Fire, not killing threats like Dreadhorde Arcanist, you do get new powerful threats like Clots, which I think is one of the most powerful Green Suns targets printed, and especially right now, it's bringing the archetype back, which is cool. So it's nice to know that they're all viable in some way.
Yeah, I actually chose to play Maverick in one of the Eternal Weekend Legacy events this year. Eternal Weekend is my Super Bowl. I love that tournament. That's what I want. That's if I win one tournament a year, I want it to be that one. And I shot one of my shots with Maverick, like on purpose. So I definitely respect the archetype. I see you have a timeline here of big printings. Like obviously 2011, Green Sun Zenith gives birth to the deck. 2012, we get Thalia in Dark Ascension. June 2012, Scavenging Ooze Commander release, by the way. Remember that before it was just in every core set? That was like a $45 card. I think I made a trade once where I got a Scavenging Ooze and I gave up a Mana Drain. Like that was like a thing for a while. Abrupt
Nice.
Decay in Return to Ravnica. Collector Oof. Holy guacamole. That's a Green Sun bullet. I hate that card.
Yeah.
I have lost so many games to a Collector Oof. And then Clothis, God of Destiny in Theros.
Beyond Death.
Beyond Death. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, so as recently as one calendar year, like we've seen printings. And then, of course, in the middle, there was the heyday of Deathrite Shaman that was a reason to put black in your Maverick deck, even if it was just a little splash.
Yeah, I put it in the middle because I didn't get too much time to play with Deathrite, so I don't have a great opinion on it. And I'm not too sure if it was doing more for the deck or more for other decks against Maverick. A little bit like Ren and 6, I felt that although you could play Ren and 6 in Maverick, it probably wasn't one of the better Ren and 6 decks around.
Right. Yeah, the last episode of Deep Analysis, we had Jarvis you say that about red-green lands. It was like, yeah, Ren and 6 was supposed to save red-green lands, but it actually killed it because it was just better in Rug Delver. So speaking of bad for Maverick, so in May of 2012, we get Terminus. In July of 2012, we got Omniscience. The reason Omniscience is a big deal, these decks were an answer to Show and Tell back in the day. Like Sneak and Show, that's a very old deck too. Every part of that deck has existed for a long time, especially in the same set as Terminus, we got Grizzlebrand. So this is the same era. And you used to be able to just put in Caracas or Knight of the Reliquary off of Show and Tell and bounce whatever legend they played. Like easy squeezy. But then Omniscience is just like, get wrecked, hardcast Emrakul, GG. 2012 gives us Supreme Verdict. 2014, Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise. Everybody suffered for that. And then that brings us up to the current era where this is a long list of cards that are bad for Maverick. Oko, Uro, Dreadhorde Arcanist, Icefang Coatl, Arkham's Astrolabe, Dead of Winter, and Plague Engineer are all bangers against Maverick and against Death and Taxes. So
yeah, echoing everything that Dukes is saying for Maverick here, these printings kind of did harmful things for Death and Taxes. So on the Omniscience one, for example, the Sneak and Show matchup was probably something like 70-30 in Death and Taxes' favor. The matchup was a joke. And then that card got printed, and all of a sudden, just holding up a Caracas Forever didn't just end the game. And the matchup became unfavorable almost overnight once people actually started playing Omniscience.
Let's get into the current metagame, which is that long list that all of those cards are still legal. Oko and Dreadhorde Arcanist give Rug Delver the ability to remove a 4/4 or bigger, which you mentioned a minute ago, like you get Knight of the Reliquary to be a 4/4. It's like Submerge or Bust from Rug Delver. I remember that. It was just like frantically pondering and brainstorming for the one Submerge before you waste all my lands. Like that play pattern just doesn't exist anymore. It's just like, it's an elk. And Dreadhorde Arcanist, all of my content, my videos, the podcast with Phil, like every Twitter post, someone's talking about Dreadhorde Arcanist being just awful for everyone in Legacy except basically Rug Delver. Both of you guys are trying to like 1-for-1 while slowly pinching off outs, kind of. There are 2-for-1s later, like with the Flicker Wisp and stuff and Death and Taxes. But in general, you're just trying to remove that, and now you're out of options to cast spells because of Wasteland Thalia, etc. But Dreadhorde Arcanist just keeps the cards going.
I'll try to keep this as general as I can to keep it useful. But it used to be that both Death and Taxes and Maverick were decks that once you hit, say, turn 7 or something like that, you're just so favored because your card quality ends up being so much higher than the card quality of your opponents. When it becomes the end game and you're playing Death and Taxes and you get to, play Recruiter of the Guard, get a Flicker Wisp, blink the Recruiter of the Guard, get another Flicker Wisp, you just bury your opponent. And when you are playing Maverick, come end game, you have knights that sometimes are 10/10s, or you have Green Sun that finds a knight. Your card quality was just better. And now everyone's not messing around anymore. Like your opponent can be playing a 6/6 creature that gains life and draw cards, or they're getting one bonus card out of the graveyard starting on turn 2 every game. And it becomes a little bit harder to just get to that point where you have just ultimate inevitability over your opponent, since the 2019 and 2020 cards have given every deck a shot in the arm.
How about Oko? Can you describe what it's like to play a Pillow Fort sort of deck where every opponent has just a repeatable Vindicate for whatever's ailing them the most in any given board state?
Like, do you want an emotional response? Like, I can cry on air. Like, we can do that. I'm not afraid. But seriously, Oko was a huge problem card for Death and Taxes, to the point where many of the most prominent Death and Taxes pilots considered the deck borderline unplayable until the printing of Skyclave Apparition, which gave the deck a convenient answer to almost every card on that list of 2019 and 2020 cards. And I know Maverick has started to incorporate that card as well, just because it's so nice to have a flexible main deck answer to powerful spells.
It's crazy to think that just a slightly pushed Oblivion Ring is what all of these decks needed. But that was such a good printing. I think for Magic, like that's the kind of card that isn't gonna ruin anyone's life. It's just good back and forth Magic.
We had about 5 years of the best hate prayers of all time being printed. Like we got this streak where it's like, oh, here's Spirit of Labyrinth, here's Recruiter of the Guard, here's Palace Jailer. Like, oh, a new Commander supplemental product? Here's a card made exactly for you, Death and Taxes player. And then 2019 and 2020 happened and all the threats caught up.
Yeah, there was a long period where the control decks all had like 2 Plague Engineer main and then another one in the side. And there's a lot of humans in Death and Taxes, and the cards that aren't humans are also X1s. When you can just destroy Mother of Runes and Thalia while getting on board, that's usually all it takes to break it open. Like the days where Sanctum Prelate on 1 plus Mother of Runes was checkmate have long gone. We're in a different world now. So, Douges, tell us about the Maverick side. Is it the same story over there against these sort of cards?
Yeah, it's tough. Especially, I'm sure Phil knows this as well. But when you're streaming as well, you got to keep pretty happy. And when Oko hits the field, it's just the same sort of. It feels like that white card, double white. You create like a sub game. Is it Shahrazad?
Yeah. Yep.
It's what Oko does. It just creates this game where you have to start attacking the Oko, forget about your opponent, and then once you've dealt with it, your opponent's probably set up a boards that you can't deal with. But it definitely is frustrating when you have to land threats to go wide around Oko, but they're just becoming 3/3s. And then there's cards like Dead of Winter you have to be scared of, or an Ice Fang, or it's just it's tough because Maverick traditionally has been a deck that has to deal with Planeswalkers through combat damage, and that's where Skyclave has been a huge printing for the deck, because now you can play a Skyclave and hopefully take out an Oko or a Khan instead of having to run your creatures into it, which is kind of nice. So I think that in a way, Skyclave has also made Ice Fang a little bit worse, because at least for Maverick, you're not having to slam your 6/6 Knight into open mana to attack an Oko and get it traded with an Ice Fang, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, that card was a big help for sure. Let's talk about Arkham's Astrolabe. So I sort of built my brand on cutting non-basic lands from my deck. My breakouts are with blue-white miracles, just 1 Tundra in the 75 for non-basic lands, and just rock solid mana. Forget the other colors. Let's not get fancy. I don't want to get wastelanded. I want to cast my spells. I'll win that sort of game. But now you can do that while being a 5-color deck. How does that feel from the wasteland contingent?
It used to be that Death and Taxes got to use Wasteland very proactively against most decks of the format. It was only occasionally that you would see a really, really rock solid mana base, like maybe something like Blue-White Miracles or something like that. And now these snow decks can often just go 3 basic lands, play an Astrolabe, that gets them to their 4th or 5th color of mana, all while being immune to Wasteland and being able to play the highest possible card quality. And the frustrating thing about it is that it used to be that if your deck was good against Wasteland, it was often bad against Rishadan Port. Because if you have, say, an island and a plains, you get cut off one of those colors in your upkeep. And then you don't have access to that color of mana in your main phase. But now the presence of Astrolabe means that Rishadan Port also gets worse too. So not only do these decks have very solid mana to start with, but they're also better against Wasteland and Port than many other similar decks in the past.
This isn't a Wasteland or Rishadan Port anecdote, but it is a basic land anecdote. At Eternal Weekend Paris last year, round 1, game 1, my opponent was on the play. They mulled to 5, and they went Ancient Tomb, Chrome Mox, Pitching Goblin Rabblemaster, cast Blood Moon with 1 card left in hand, pass the turn. And I went Basic Island, Arkham's Astrolabe, pass the turn with 7 cards in hand. And it was just like all the fetch lands in my hand that would have been mountains a year before that were just Birds of Paradise instead. And I even got a cantrip for my trouble. So yeah, that card has certainly punished the people out there looking to beat up on non-basic lands.
Yeah, I think one point as well for both decks is a lot of the time you don't just want sort of one creature on the field acting as a speed bump. You want to have your resources working in tandem together. And having Thalia on board and also wastelanding your opponent is so nice. But now that obviously can't be wastelanding your opponent most of the time, I feel like Thalia is a little bit restricted as well with her effectiveness on some matchups.
From the blue side, I used to really feel that squeeze of like Thalia is a +1, Rishadan Port's a +1, Wasteland is keeping me under the threshold. But now Thalia is just like, okay, I'm going to play his turn one turn off curve rather than my whole life is crumbling. It's a totally different feeling from the other side.
When Thalia was originally printed, it was arguably the best hate bear of all time. And it used to just be far and away one of the best things that you could be doing as a Death and Taxes player. And now there's a lot of times where I hit turn 2 and it's like, well, is Thalia actually the right play anymore? How disruptive is this actually to my opponent? Like, what if they have a Dreadhorde Arcanist in play? Like, they use one of their mana to cast their spell from their graveyard, and that was my turn, and I'm way behind. So you'll see many Death and Taxes players actually trimming on Thalia in post-sideboard games now, which would have been heresy a couple years ago.
Yeah, we recorded a lead together on this channel about a month ago, and the number of times you instructed me to cut Thalia sort of blew my mind. And I actually recorded a modern Death and Taxes league just a couple days ago, and I used that rule. Because we spent that time talking about how Thalia isn't what she used to be, I cut or trimmed Thalia a lot, and it just felt so weird, but it was also definitely right. Those sort of angles, the 2-for-1s, the Arkham's Astrolabes, that makes it a lot harder to play a 1-for-1 game that Maverick certainly wants to play. Death and Taxes has those late game engines like the Stoneforge Mystic is card advantage, the Flicker Wisp is card advantage, the Recruiter. But Maverick, you're mostly trying to get over the finish line, right?
Yeah, it's tough. So obviously, as you said, a lot of it is 1-for-1, which I think is where a lot of players have been moving away from and trying to find some value. So things like playing Knight of Autumn over Sully Pride Mage because you're getting the ability still, and then you're having a creature around that your opponent has to deal with. With a card like Astrolabe, instead of being aggressive with Abrupt Decay or maybe a Knight, you could play Collect Oof, which shuts off the Astrolabes, but then also demands a card from your opponent if they want to turn those back on. And sort of similar with some of the black versions of Maverick playing Plague Engineer. Instead of using a Swords to Plowshares on an Icewing that's drawing a card, you can just play something proactive like a Plague Engineer naming Snake, which forces your opponent to deal with it and kind of go down on cards when otherwise you might be the one sort of going down on card parity.
Planeswalkers too. Honestly, the reason I played Maverick at Eternal Weekend this year was Kaya. Like that card just lined up so well with what the format was doing at the time. It pressures Urose with the and Dreadhorde Arcanist with the plus ability, the exile cards for the graveyard. The minus hits an Astrolabe, hits a Merit Lage. Kaya was just such a beating.
Yeah, Kai's been awesome. I know Achilles27 did a list of everything that she hits in Legacy, and there are a fair few things. And then having the upside of just having extra ways to deal with an Uro while it's in the bin. It is a win condition as well. And there have been times on stream where my opponent has obviously not read the ulti, attacked me instead of attacking the Kaya, and then I've just untapped, attacked for like 3, put him to 12, and then exiled Kaya for 12. So that's pretty cool. One Planeswalker I've been looking at recently because of how Wasteland is matching up against decks like Snow is Nissa Vital Force. I don't want to cut all my Wastelands against the deck like that because I do bring in a fair amount of Planeswalkers and I do want to be hitting my land drops. But Nissa's cool because it does kind of give Wasteland a role in the matchup where it creates it into a 5/5 creature and demands an answer where my opponent otherwise might not really care about Wasteland.
Yeah, I love it. Nissa Vital Force. From my Elves days, she was the mother of that deck for a while. Speaking of mothers, Klothys. Oh my god, that's a magic card. Tell me about Klothys.
Yeah, Klothys is Maverick's answer to Snow and a lot of those decks, really. It's a really hard threat to deal with. A lot of decks haven't really managed to find an answer that's good enough. You don't see like Celestial Purges or Council's Judgment coming back. It's really a case of something like Teferi Bounce and then hopefully counter it on the way back down. But there's been a lot of matchups where Snow's dealt with all my threats, but Klothys has been there just dealing 2 each time, and it's dealt 20 damage. And it's, turn 13, and they just haven't found a way to get rid of it. Can be a little bit awkward in the late game when your opponent can create an Oko with some food and start gaining back that life, but it's exactly what Maverick wants. It's a disruptive threat that's hard to deal with. Obviously, in Maverick, you get 5 copies of it with Green Suns, which is really nice.
So, kind of on that note, something that we've mentioned already is that Death and Taxes and Maverick can be tailored specifically for a metagame. And this is something that you not only can do, this is something that you should or need to be doing. Death and Taxes and Maverick tend to perform the best when you have a really well-tuned list that specifically addresses the problems that you're seeing in a metagame. If you pick up your deck list from 6 months ago because there's a Star City Open in town, can you play that event and do okay with your deck? Yes, absolutely. But if you have, your finger on the pulse of the format, you know exactly what you need to beat, how you're sideboarding in a matchup, what threats and what slots you need at any given time. That's how you're going to have the greatest chance of success with these decks.
Yeah, that's true for every deck, obviously, but especially true for a deck like this. The brainstorm decks, if you pick your metagame spot wrong and you just have some like a braid or something in the main deck, like that was your tech and you just picked wrong, you can brainstorm that away. You can shuffle with the ponder when you see it. Like Death and Taxes and Maverick don't get that luxury, so you need to make sure every card just is oozing with value.
A great example from the past year is the rise of some of the spell-based combo decks that we've been seeing. The modal double-faced cards started making things like Oops All Spells much more popular. And Doomsday has been picking up in popularity as well. And if you pick up an old Death and Taxes list that doesn't have a few additional answers to that, say Mindbreak Trap or Deafening Silence, you're going to have a bad time and you're going to be really frustrated with your rounds.
Maverick and D&T are similar as well, that you play with the hand that you're dealt. So if you do have a Collector Oof in your opening and you're playing against Elves, that's just bad luck. Or if you have, Swords to Plowshares against Ant, that's pretty bad luck too. So as Phil mentioned, trying to tune your deck towards what you believe you're going to play, especially locally, if you can figure out that you don't need Gadok Teague in your 75 because no one plays combo, or you don't need Collector Oof because no one is playing any artifact-based decks, then that's a pretty huge bonus that you can have, because 2/2 for 2 isn't that great when it does literally nothing else.
So speaking of picking your spots and how to build the deck, what's going on with Maverick right now? What are you doing to mitigate those Okos and the Arcanists, that list of hitters that we've just talked about?
Yeah, well, Abrupt Decay is a pretty nice answer to both. And over the course of 2020, most of the biggest finishes have been with Abzan, but Achilles has done pretty well. I believe he finished second in 2 or 3 challenges with Abzan. It's really the case of trying to find that inner value. So some of the cards that can 2-for-1 your opponent. Sylvan Library is pretty strong with keeping up with those decks, so that Oko doesn't just turn your threats into pretty much nothing. Yeah, it's been tough. I think punishing Maverick's actually in a pretty nice spot because it allows you to fight on the stack and stops your opponent from getting the value of something like an Ice Fang drawing a card or an Uro drawing a card. And then, of course, Kloss in the main deck is a pretty nice threat to have for a lot of matchups. I've recently been playing with Bant, so if you can't beat him, join him.
Yeah.
And thankfully with Maverick, you do have the option of playing a turn 2 Oko even on the draw, which is really nice. You do get cards like Uro, but they're not really needed in Maverick. It's a nice one-off to have because it's just so good against a deck like Delver. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting spot for Maverick. I wouldn't say it's the greatest spot to be in, but there's obviously a lot of people who love the deck and are still just pushing out and trying to get results. And I think that definitely helps for trying to find the light at the end of the tunnel for the current metagame.
What do you think about like the future for Maverick? Is there anything unexplored or not explored enough, or it's from the past and it might be time to come back?
Yeah, so myself and Matt Vuk have been testing out a few lists with Brainstorm, and obviously Maverick has traditionally been a deck that tries to bully and pressure those decks with Brainstorm, but when one of your massive weaknesses, keeping a hand with cards that are just invalid against some opponents, you're stuck with them. But Brainstorm gives you the out of being able to trade those in for hopefully resources that will work out in your favor. The deck naturally has a lot of shuffles as well. You have Fetches, Knights, Green Suns, and Stoneforge. The only issue right now is that if you're adding Brainstorm to the deck, you're also running into a lot of the Hull Breacher decks that are just going to press you even worse. So I'm not sure if it's the right time to be testing some of the Brainstorm versions, but I think it's something that it's worth looking into because it does fix a key problem with the deck.
I think that's really important. For a long time, various legacy decks were kind of like stuck in the same position. Their deck composition looked the same for years and years and years. And then somebody tried a crazy idea that actually worked. Most of the time, when you try something new, it's a failure. It doesn't work out, but you always learn something by doing those. And then sometimes a few years later, all of a sudden, it's a great time to try something new. So, for example, prior to Skyclave's Apparitions printing, Death and Taxes was in a really bad spot. And so I was trying all sorts of crazy things to try to make it work. And none of them worked. But every time I learned something. This week, we're splashing black. This week, we're playing Ancient Tomb. This week, we're cutting Aether Vials and trying Chrome Mox instead. And even though I wasn't super successful in any of those experiments, it gave me new directions to try to attack the format from. And I think that's a very important skill if you're going to try to stick to a deck like Death and Taxes or Maverick in the very, very, very long term.
It's a really important lesson too. So like Legacy's expensive. It's hard to learn. I can imagine like putting in years of hard work into an archetype like you two have, and it just being bad for a while because they printed Oko. Like that's got to be a tough spot to maneuver out of. Like mentally, Dukes, you mentioned when you're live on stream, it's got to be fun. Like nobody wants to see you just like cry into your cereal on camera. That's not what anyone shows up for. I get the feeling too. Like I play solid decks, solid mana with solid answers. That's what I like. But the past couple of months, I've been taking donation decks on my channel. So I've been trying all sorts of stuff that I wouldn't have chosen for myself. And the difference between like Oko resolving when I'm like, oh, I can dig to my moat and make all the Elks irrelevant, or I could just draw a Pyroblast or Abrupt Decay in the next couple turns. It's not a huge deal. Versus like, I have nothing. I'm just dead. This is a mono white deck. What am I supposed to do about this idiot? They had it on turn 2. Like I couldn't beat it on turn 5, and it's here on turn 2. Learning how to build, like get creative to get out of that, and be careful with that line of conversation because it sort of ends up on like borderline gaslighting at some point where it's like Death and Taxes does not have the tools to beat Oko. Like pre-Skyclave Apparition, it's like we can throw crap at the wall all day, and if like people are just like try harder, you're not even innovating. It's like no, this card's actually a huge problem. Like validate us a little bit here. So there's a line there, but I think that like shouting into the void that Legacy sucks versus trying some new cards. There's a lot of space in between quitting
Yeah,
Legacy and continuing to lose all the time.
yeah. Last week, for example, Death and Taxes had been putting up like abysmal results in challenge events, something along the line of like 30% win rate over like multiple weeks in a row. So I was like, okay, crazy person. What happens if we cut a bunch of the traditional top end from the deck? What if I just play a pile of Sarah Avengers and then a bunch of Luminarch aspirants and I try to get my opponent dead as quickly as possible? And that's the sort of thinking you want to be doing if your current build isn't working out. Now, is that necessarily the best answer to this metagame? No, probably not. But are those the sorts of lines that you want to be thinking about if you want to be, like one of the better Death and Taxes pilots, come many years down the line? Yes.
I know that you tested Luminarch Aspirant pretty heavily when it first came out, where like a lot of the community was just like, "LOL, no," which that's not a good attitude to have about any card, even if you don't think it's good. Like put in the rep, see if it's actually good or not. But I played against that card a couple times when I was on in like Rug Delver leagues, where it just comes down turn 2 on the play, and I'm like, "Oh, I don't care about that." But then 2 turns later, I can't beat it. So like showing something the proper respect, like finding some sort of pivot that the format's not ready for, un-okoable threats basically, like Luminarch Aspirate, like you oko it, it turns from a 3/3 into a 5/5. There's definitely some room to brew there. All the colors that Maverick's been trying, a lot of cool stuff. Like Magic's such a cool game. Phil, where do you see Death and Taxes moving from here? Is there a clear future? Or is it just like what white bears are we going to get printed, and that's going to affect us forever?
As of this set's release, as of Kaldheim's release when we're recording this, it looks like the power level of this set is much lower than what we have seen in the last 2 years. And if that carries forward, then we're probably going to keep getting sick hate bears in the supplemental products that are a little bit too pushed for standard, and Death and Taxes will continue to accrue some new toys over time. There are some things that the deck has been wanting for a long time that it hasn't quite gotten. So, for example, some sort of rest in peace-esque bear would be a wonderful addition to the deck, especially if it's good enough to be main deckable, give you a little more game versus things like Uro and Dreadhorde Arcanist, as well as like, oops, I accidentally win versus the occasional graveyard combo deck. As a general statement, Death and Taxes is probably going to continue to be a metagame player for the vast majority of Legacy's existence, and that's because it tends to be very good against the best deck of the format, which is usually some flavor of Delver. And if you're the deck that beats Delver, even if you're, getting bullied by some of the other decks, you're still in an okay position overall.
Do you have something in the tank? Like, do you have an eject button, or are you just in because that's what you do?
So I have this reputation as the Death and Taxes guy because like I made the Death and Taxes website and I have been playing this deck for about 10 years. But if you actually go and, do some Googling of my results, you'll see that I have finishes with a whole bunch of stuff, not just in Legacy, but in other formats as well. So my range is much wider than people give me credit for a lot of time. And a huge part of that is because like I'm playing these donation deck lists every week on my channel. So I've played just about everything that Legacy has to offer. So am I going to force Death and Taxes when it's bad? No. Should you force Death and Taxes when it's bad? If you have other options, no. If it's your only deck, yeah, get in there, battle, fight. Legacy is fun most of the time. But a lot of times, if you have skills with Death and Taxes, they transfer over very well to other decks like Maverick and Four Color Loam, and even prison decks like Red Prison. And so if you have the option to pivot decks to something else that's slightly better position, it's sometimes a good idea to do so.
Duke, same question. Are you just on Maverick for life, or do you move with the metagame when a tournament is important enough?
Usually, if it's a local event, I will just run Maverick. But I do have a fair few other decks, which is nice. I will say that if you aren't enjoying your deck and you get the chance to play other decks, you can actually learn a lot about your original deck and some of the matchups, and what you might not consider a key card, but then you play against your deck, you're like, wow, that's actually really hard to beat. Like, maybe I should be more patient with Night of the Reliquary or Scavenging Ooze and wait for it to be a 4/4 or wait for it to have mana up or something like that, because this was like really hard to beat. So that's another really good bonus of playing other decks is, you just don't learn about that deck, you learn about your own deck, which is kind of cool.
All right. I want to tell an embarrassing anecdote about myself. back before I had like a really good dedicated testing team that I could call on when I needed to prepare for events, I physically proxied up just about every deck in the format and I would play them against myself. Like I would sit down, both hands on the table, and just kind of watch how the games would play out if both players were, playing as optimally as possible. And doing that sort of thing really let me see, where do I need to be picking my fights? What do I need to be doing? What's my role in this matchup? What is my opponent looking for? And when you're playing these non-blue decks that don't get to like have cantrips save them when things are a little bit rough, you need to know your game plan from the get-go. And so like having your reps in matters so much with decks like Maverick and Death and Taxes.
I thought that was going to be an embarrassing story, but who hasn't done that? I've told this story in a couple different on the podcast and stuff before, but I played Death and Taxes, I think twice in sanctioned tournaments, and in one of them, I played against my friend on Rug Delver. Rug Delver versus Death and Taxes was a matchup I played 1,000 times before, but I'm usually on the other side. And at the time, conventional wisdom was you cut your Force of Wills because you can't really afford a 2-for-1. None of their cards are good enough to be worth 2 cards on their own, etc. And my friend did not cut any of his Force of Wills. And he forced 3 of my key spells over the course of that game. And at the end, I was like, you left your forces in? Like, do you even know how to play Legacy? And he was like, if any of your spells resolved, I would have lost. That's such like a simple, elegant way to challenge conventional wisdom. And he's totally right. Like they were bangers. It was like a Cataclysm and like a Gideon and a Palace Jailer or something. It was like the high end stuff. And any one of them would have broken the game open, but he left his forces in. And being able to feel what it was like on the other side, where you work this long-term plan into sticking that Palace Jailer on an empty board just to have it forced, that changed how I thought about these fair matchups pretty fundamentally.
Yeah, I feel like with Maverick and D&T as well, you got to plan ahead. You can't just react to what your opponent's going to do. So the difference between winning a game and staying in it could be playing Thalia on turn 2 instead of playing your Stoneforge Mystic or Green Sunning for a Mana Dork or something. So knowing how other decks play against you and knowing how they have to shift to like, oh, I gotta win quick if I'm an Ant before they land a Thalia or a Gaddock can really give you some insights as well, so that when you're playing against the deck, you know the right decision, even if you don't know what your opponent has in hand.
It's so frustrating for new players to pick up Death and Taxes because they play the games and they're like, there was nothing I could do. And I was watching them play and I'm like, hey, so you lost this game on turn 2 when you led on this card instead of this card. And here's how it changed the entire scope of the game. And they're like, wait, hold on. What? You're telling me that I planned my turn 2 wrong and that cost me the game on turn 8? Yes. Yes, I am.
Yep. And I've played against Death and Taxes in a lot of situations where like they're porting me off white for like 6 turns in a row, and then they just randomly decide to port me off blue now, and then they lose to my white cards that they've been locking down the whole game. Just like those little, like, you gotta have a plan and you gotta stick to it. It's heavy, like to think of that. Like that scares me. Like I made the same point in the last episode talking about Dark Depths and lands, but like decks without counterspells and cantrips are way harder to play correctly than the blue decks. Like I think the common belief is that blue control decks are hard. The game's really long. You have to make so many decisions. 2 of those 3 things are true. All of your decisions, you make a lot of them, but they're all binary. It's like, does this kill me? If yes, counter or remove it. If not, let it go. And you just make that decision until they're out of threats or you're out of answers and someone wins the game. Death and Taxes. If your hand is like Plains, Mother of Runes, Aether Vial, Thalia against Ad Nauseam Tendrils, like the conventional wisdom of get Aether Vial into play early and often versus like if I curve Mother of Runes into Thalia, then Abrupt Decay's off. Like I don't know what to do in that situation. I just pulled that out of my head, but like you need to know that. Like if you die on turn 2 because you didn't protect your Thalia with your Mother of Runes, you went for Aether Vial instead, versus if you lose later because your Aether Vial's not on high enough counters. Like, I don't know. That's the sort of stuff that takes a lot of work to get good at.
Yeah, with these sorts of decks, the first level is I need to learn the heuristics. I need to learn the common mental shortcuts that I need to understand how to like play my opening turns. And the higher levels are, okay, now here's the 3,000 fringe scenarios that change all of your heuristics and make it so that the things you normally do are wrong. Oh, and by the way, those things tend to change every, 2 or 3 turns over the course of a game, and they're not just constant. Death and Taxes is often hailed, along with Lands, as being one of the more difficult decks to master in Legacy. And I've been playing this deck for 10 years. And I can tell you that every time I play this deck, I still learn new things. I learn how to approach matchups better. I learn how to mulligan better. I learn how to sequence better. And if you're in for the long haul with a deck like Death and Taxes or Maverick, it's so fun because you can like see your little level ups and you start to see the things that you used to miss.
Especially on MTGO where the rules are there and you don't really have any interaction with them. One interaction that I found recently is that if you block like a Vampire Hexmage with Dried Arbor and then go to float green to then eat it with a Scavenging Ooze once it dies, there's actually no time for that. In paper, you just do it. You just be like, okay, block before damage, float, and eat it with Scoos. But you actually don't have a sequence to do that, which is really interesting. And at first, I thought it was MTGO. That was incorrect, but obviously, it was me.
Yeah, there was a time in Magic's history where mana emptied at the end of phases. Now it empties at the end of steps. That happened a couple years ago. The other day, I was playing against Dredge, and I used Karn the Great Creator plus liquid metal coating to destroy one of their lands, and that triggered their Bridge from Below because Karn turned it into a 0/0 creature. In paper, we both would have just put that land in the graveyard and nobody would have known the better for it. But like, it is cool to see those like little things come up, and like that's a level up in that deck too, because now I know I can destroy my own land with Karn to blow up their bridges. So like, just definitely getting the reps in until you experience those 1,000 little things that may never come up again. But when it does, you're going to be ready. So we're approaching the hour mark here. You guys have any thoughts that we haven't explored yet that you want to dump on us before we sign off?
I guess one is don't be afraid to test against the grain. So I know that Phil's been testing out some decks without the full playset of Flicker Wisps, and things like Maverick players have been starting to trim from the stock for Nard the Reliquary, because if Wasteland isn't great and a lot of your nights getting answered by cards like Oko, then it's probably worth testing out maybe another 3-drop like Tireless Tracker, where you might be able to gain some extra value, or maybe even lower the curve and play some more 2-drops, or maybe even like a 1-drop threat like Hex Drinker could be your answer. So yeah, don't be afraid to do what some people might just think is wrong without even sort of giving it the light of day.
If you're going to pick up one of these decks, what I highly recommend you do is find a buddy who can watch some of your matches after you play them. Whether you record them, whether they watch you play in person, get someone else to sit there and ask you, why did you do that? Because a lot of times when you first start one of these decks, you're like, well, I had mana to cast something, so I figured I should cast something. And that person poking you and asking you, why are you doing the things that you're doing? Why aren't you doing this? Is going to lead to a lot of growth very quickly.
Yeah, I'll just jump on that in general. Like these decks, especially importantly, but Magic the Gathering or any other hobby or at your job, like whatever. Like if someone says like, "Hey, I think this could have been done better this way," instead of getting like mad or defensive or whatever, even if they're wrong, taking the time to explain to them why the thing you did was better than the thing they suggested is a valuable learning experience. Like ever since I started streaming and releasing videos, having to say out loud why I ponder in the order I do, or like why I save my fetch land for the upkeep instead of cracking in the end step, just like all these little things I do by like automatically at this point, saying them out loud makes you really explore them and understand them in a way that is great. Take advice, get around people better than you. If somebody has feedback, just roll with it. Understand that most people want to help you get better. They're not just trying to be jerks. But if they're being a jerk, you don't have to listen to them. But try to figure out what the difference is. Let's sign off here with just a reminder of where we can find you. Listeners, I'm going to put all of these links in the video description below. Douges, where are you? One more time. Your website, your Twitch, everything.
greensunzenith.com, twitch.tv/DougesOnTwitch, and then you can find me on YouTube at /DougesOnTwitch and Twitter /DougesOnTwitch.
And you can find me at ThrabenU on YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. And if you're looking for any of my Death and Taxes content, it's available at ThrabenUniversity.com. There is a lot of information there, but just as a heads up, I haven't updated a lot of it recently because I've been working more on the video content. So if you're looking for like up-to-date videos, check the YouTube rather than the website.
All right. Thanks, dudes. This was a good conversation, and I'll see you out there in the trenches.